Epistemology. Fun word to say in order to confuse people, but it's actually a fairly simple concept. How do we know what we know? How is it that what we think we know can actually be verified or self-evidently true? And I want to put out as an example two common schools of thought for how to answer the question of epistemology. Is our knowledge related to truth? Meaning, even if there is truth, how do we know it? How do we apprehend it? Do we even want to know it? And these two schools of thought are ancient, yet if you push most worldviews, they really seem to boil into these two, for the most part. It's not to say these are the only two. However, these are kind of the two main ones, and they go all the way back as far as being articulated. They probably go back further than this as far as being used, but being kind of identified to some ancient Greek philosophers named Plato, the writer for Socrates, so we can kind of include Socrates in that as well, and Aristotle, who both contributed some of the most important philosophy that shaped the world, especially the West. Now, important doesn't mean that they are above critique by any means, and that's kind of the point of this video. And their 2 points of view can really be expressed as rationalism, that would be Plato, and empiricism, that would be Aristotle. And rationalism, Plato's worldview was really about the idea of the perfect forms of things, that things in this world matched the idea of a somewhat perfect form. So like a chair in this world is not really a chair. It's not the form of the chair, but it has chairness. Like there's a perfect chair that it's represented by. And so Plato's worldview was one of rationalism, that if we think about these things, we reason, that we can understand the world if our reasoning is correct and consistent. There's elements of that are true. And can't deny the importance of reason. Aristotle, on the other hand, acknowledged the importance of reason. He was a student of Plato. But Aristotle was a little bit more horizontal in his view. Followed more the idea of empiricism, that truth can be observed and documented. And Aristotle borrows from rationalism as well, because Aristotle develops kind of the terminology of what we would call Aristotelian logic. He doesn't invent logic, and logic is just consistent truth that is self-evident. That being said, here are the problems fundamentally with those worldviews. Although they contribute much, but I think their presuppositions do not allow them to have the explanatory power in order to claim ultimate truth. With rationalism, the idea of the thinking of the human mind and reason, it has to self-evidently assume that reason is always valid. Now, how do you demonstrate reason is valid? Well, only through reasoning. And therefore, it gets into a circle of authority or what might be called circular reasoning. Now, I don't think it's a vicious circle to say that you use logic in order to demonstrate logic. However, there have to be presuppositions underneath that in order for that truth to work. And so it falls into a fallacy. If you just assume rationality, it falls into a fallacy called question begging, which is similar. It's the same thing as circular reasoning. Because in order to establish reason as the authority, you have to assume reason, and you have to use it. So, but that doesn't justify it as an authority that will necessarily lead to truth. Aristotle recognized this, even though he is kind of considered in a way like a father of, Western logic. Not that logic is simply something that only applies geographically, applies everywhere. But Aristotle recognized this problem, is that the fundamental starting point of logic is called the Law of Non-Contradiction. The fundamental starting point of logic is the Law of Non-Contradiction, which is often stated in philosophy books as A cannot be A and non-A at the same time in the same relationship, so that there is a differentiation and a distinction between things. So you cannot have logically a triangle that is also a square. Now those are definitions, but if we define a triangle a certain way, we define a square as a certain way, then built into the definition, it is analytically true that a triangle cannot be a square. A cannot be a square cannot be a square and a triangle at the same time in the same relationship. Something cannot exist and not exist at the same time. Something cannot create itself. So, that's the fundamental premise of logic. However, Aristotle recognized that if you apply the same principles of logic to logic, you end up with what he called infinite regress, meaning it's a situation where you have to continually go back to logic in order to prove logic. And you never really get to the bottom till you just say logic is the ultimate authority. But you can't say logic is the ultimate authority without assuming logic is the ultimate authority. And so, Aristotle recognized the problems with rationalism, although it has a value. And I do believe logic is self-evidently true, self-evidently valid. But that's because of certain presuppositions underneath that I think explain consistently. Now, for Aristotle's problem, his view is empiricism. We come to truth, we come to knowledge, and knowledge has been philosophically defined as justified true belief, meaning it's belief that you believe about something that's true, but you don't just believe it accidentally, you have a justified belief in something. I could believe that the sky is true, sky is blue, something that is true, but believe it for a bad reason. I could think it's blue because of, some absurd thing. But problem with that is that it's true, but it's not justified. You can also have a belief that is untrue, but you have reasons why you think it. You have justifications. You can also have any kind of mix of those things. So, waiting for a car to pass, so I can cross here. So that's what knowledge is defined as. And so knowledge is justified true belief. So Aristotle believed that you could come to knowledge through empirical observation, that you had to observe and experience something in order for it to be true. I mean, it was true already, but your knowledge of it came through experience, or experimentation. And this has truth and validity as far as it goes as well, because you can do this. This is the scientific method, that which is observable, repeatable, testable. But underneath the scientific method, you also have to have certain presuppositions, because empiricism runs into the same problem. Empiricism is the belief that knowledge is gained through experimentation or experience and testing. Empiricism, empirical gathering of data, information. The problem is, if empiricism is true on its own, it cannot be true logically. Here's why. Because the assumption or the belief that you find knowledge of the truth through testing, through empirical verification, is a thought, an idea, and a belief that has to be assumed before it is proven. You have to assume that empiricism is true before you prove that empiricism is true. And therefore, empiricism, according to its own standard and its own definitions, is not a valid way of knowing on its own. Now, these worldviews did not remain with Plato and Aristotle. These worldviews are really what has come down to us through history in our day. And ultimately, if you push worldviews and philosophies far enough, they amount to these two, rationality and empiricism, with all their problems. So, leave it there, but it is important to think through, well then, what is necessary? What solves that issue of the fact that rationalism and empiricism do not meet their own standards for epistemology, the way of knowing how we know what we know, how we get to justified true belief, or that which is called knowledge. And so that takes some careful thought, thinking, what are the necessary presuppositions that can bring both rationalism and empiricism into their correct place of authority, subservient, though, to something else, another ultimate authority.